If you follow typical world development in timelines, you would hear about the Stone Age that began in 3003 in 3,300,000 years ago and ended at about 5,000 years ago, beginning the Bronze Age that began at about 5,000 years ago to about 1,400 years ago. And about 1200 BC, you have the Iron Age. And the Iron Age then is not replaced but added to by the Classical Era in 500 BC. And then we have today. This timeline makes sense in terms of Europe, but it doesn't make sense in terms of Africa, because Africa, though it had a Stone Age, did not have a lot of these other ages. Instead, smelting seems to have just caught on in all ways. The prevailing theory right now is that ancient people of Africa about 2500 BC, that's the latest estimation, the full proof, the full evidence is about 1000 BC, which means it's impossible for the technology to have come from Turkey where it starts in Europe. So these development systems, which are very different than those in Europe, that use very large uh, iron smelting technologies, are very incredible. But more than that, a lot of ores and a lot of mixes of metals happen at the same time, which tells you that there was something bigger happening at the time. And because of this, you start to see civilization grow in a way like never before. Farming, you would think, would start with this, but farming in Africa starts maybe like 7,000 BC. It starts a long time ago. And I don't mean the farming that they do today, just accidental farming with then people doing small versions of it and only later transferring into real farming. All this took place in Central West Africa. Central West Africa is one of those places in history that if you do not look at it, you do not understand the history of human beings. It's like the picture of the world without its eyes. Sure, you can see the human in general, but the soul of the earth is clearly there. Now, I want to put this in context for you guys. When I'm saying iron was invented independently in Africa, I'm not joking. And the reason for it is quite obvious why we believe it's independent, because it's created at about the same time, or at least the evidence that we see for iron smelting and iron weapons and stuff like that in Africa, the full proof is at the same time as we see it anywhere else in the world at about 1300 to 500 BC, that era, really 1500 BC. And the reason why this is so intriguing is because, first of all, why is it happening at a similar time? Even though it's thought that in Africa it might have happened even at about 1,000 years before this, but a lot is lost in Africa over the years, eaten by the forests. There's a lot of brush. There's a lot of stuff in Africa that makes things disappear. And something more shocking, if you want to get shocked, if you want to get shocked, is that these other places, they had a lot of other periods that grabbed them and forced them down a hole. So they learned from their previous periods how to make things. So they had already made swords out of bronze. They had already made, other tools out of bronze or brass or these other items. Whereas in Africa, all of these items seem to be invented at the same time. So the technology, there must have been something huge that happened in that period, because civilization starts then. in that area, real civilization. Farming starts then. Almost everything that the world seemed to have developed covers in this short period of time. And not only that, they start to defeat the world. And in my estimation, you know, we're starting to look at people who could have developed stuff like glass or anything like that had they been given more time. Now, some people will probably think, well, it probably went through Egypt and stuff like that. But let's look at Egypt. Egypt really started smelting iron in about 500 BC. This is about 300 years later than the latest oldest one, which I think is in somewhere in Sierra Leone, thereabout, in those regions. It's even later than that one, meaning that the entire history of Egypt, they this technology eluded them. They had stuff like lead, they had stuff like tin, copper, brass, all these other things which are present here in these West African regions. But again, this proves that it was independent because even Egypt didn't have this technology that because in Egypt, where they got iron from, the earliest iron was from meteorites, which they fashioned into swords and stuff. Like I said, they had other metals which they fashioned. It would have been interesting to see what a West African army, considering what they did later, what a West African army of 500 BC or 1000 BC would have done to an Egyptian army, considering what was available to them. That's why it's funny today that people like to talk about intelligence and IQ and all this other stupid stuff when we know damn well that people from ancient times in Africa were out there out competing other nations in things that to them were state of the art, to us was old. Even things like the wheel, which, timeline wise, seems like it was invented somewhere in the Middle East, it doesn't completely go against the history of Africa. Now, how the wheel would have been utilized, how circles and things like that would have been utilized is quite different. And I've shown you the checkered patterns and stuff like that. Geometry was there in Africa at a hardcore rate. But because, of course, there has to be some excuse, they call it instinctive geometry. Like somehow we just know how to build squares using instinct instead of using true mathematics. And also, there's some people who think that it's disrespectful to try and connect the ancient Egyptian civilization to the Bantu civilization or the North African civilizations to the Bantu civilizations, which, something I'm starting to realize is that this separation is not a weakness, but a strength because it shows that we did everything independently of anybody and that our civilizations are built from a true understanding, not even deep trade with other areas of the world, but a sort of isolationist and mass independent resource and like just the pinning of our resources. And given how abundant some of our countries are, we were on another rise. It's truly a satanic thing that happened that stopped our rise, given how far we could have gone and how far we were going. Because truly, Bantu civilizations did not stop until the 1900s when they were forced to stop. And then our independence was undermined, and we're looked at as if we just, you know, just only 10 years ago, only 10 years before the 1900s, we were creating independent stone structures. And then after those 10 years, the theory is that Africans can't build anything.